A lot of what I was going to say has been covered a lot, but I'll go for it anyway. First, I'd like to start with a quote. Anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And on my way here, I was listening to the radio and I heard a couple of interesting stories. One of them was this huge water crisis in Sao Paulo in Brazil. They have major shortage of water because of major drought that's going on, primarily because of climate change stuff. And then the other story was about people in Malawi and what they were doing, and they realized they've had drought issues and massive flood issues, and they also have a very fast-growing population, and they realized that part of the problems with that is people are planting more on hillsides, cutting down more trees, all of those kinds of things. And so they're doing something really unusual. They are promoting and working on birth control in their own nation. This is something very unusual for their culture and their religions and that kind of a thing. So that was pretty interesting to me. And the exponential growth thing and how this has to do with population control, it's basically human consumption. Fundamentally, there's another quote, fundamentally controlled and driven by the world's elites, that is putting the survival of the world at risk. And it's not because of reproductive behavior of poor populations. And the greatest impacts of climate change are on poor people. I wanted to talk mainly about agriculture, and to talk about agriculture, I kind of have to go big rather than talking specifically about Hawaii. The United States has gone through a number of different agricultural periods. The first period from 1600 to 1920 was called the expansion period. This is basically just people going onto land, putting more and more acres into production. The second period from 1920 to 1970 was the mechanization period. And that's the time of cheap fossil fuel, super high yields, much bigger farms, and basically a total change in world agriculture, in large part because of nitrogen fertilizer. And during that time period, we saw like 100-fold increase in 100 years, 100-fold increase in the amount of produce that was produced, that the United States was able to put out. And at the same time, we saw a huge reduction in the number of people who are farming. We went from like, say, 40 or 50% of the people involved in farming to like, today it's like less than 2% of people are involved in farming. And that has been the American dream, is basically to get off of the farm. And during that same time period, because of that huge production of food, the price of food also as a percentage of people's income also went way down. In 1950, 20% of a family's income went for food. And in the year 2000, it's around 10%. So people are actually paying less now for food than they ever did before. However, that doesn't show the true picture. Gross domestic product is basically stealing from the future and selling it in the present. And it doesn't tell you all of the costs that go on. It doesn't tell you doesn't say anything, tells you nothing about the state of inequality which is happening in this world. And that was referred to some by John Witeck too. The people in the United States, I think it's like 60% of all wage earners are earning less than $20 an hour. And there's like also a huge percentage, like 18 million workers who are earning less than $10 an hour. And those are the people who are feeling the food problems and the food crunch. So, agriculture. That saturation period, from the saturation period is the next period after the mechanization period, is 1970 to now. And what that's meant is basically more energy, more pesticides, and more environmental destruction. That industrialization of agriculture that's happened during that mechanization period and is continuing to happen today, that's caused huge amounts of problems. And the way it's worked with all that, the chemical fertilizer and everything, when Europeans first got the United States, the average depth of topsoil in the United States was 18 inches. Today, the average depth of topsoil is around 6 inches. So basically, we've been mining that soil all this time, and the yields, yeah, they soared, but now they're leveling off, they're starting to decline, and we're seeing more and more problems. So that industrialization of farms has to change. We actually have to de-industrialize farms, and we need to plan for it. We can't just wait for some huge destructive force to happen and make us do it. So what a lot of people are talking about is we need to it's called re-ruralization of our communities. We need to build a different food system. We've been farming, my brother Paul and I have been farming for 40 years, and we've come to believe that the future of farming is not more farmers. The future of farming is a way bigger percentage of people involved in some aspect of growing food. For example, maybe like you all probably heard of CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, where people go and they get a box of produce every week. Well, what if getting that box of produce, you paid a certain amount of money for it, but you also paid in labor, so that people went out and they participated in more community-run kinds of farms. And with the climate change stuff that's going on, like I said about Malawi, these people are taking matters into their own hands. This is the movement that a lot of people are now thinking needs to happen, is we need to make changes. We can't wait for governments to do those kinds of things. We need to rebuild our communities. We need to recreate communities. A lot of suburban neighborhoods that have grown a lot over the years, people all live on the same street and they have no idea who their neighbors are. They don't know anything about them. So that's the kinds of changes we think needs to happen. That urbanization, that constant growth that the other speakers were talking about, that's been causing a lot of problems in the United States. Let's see. Since 1970, the U.S. has been losing farmland to urbanization at the rate of 2 acres or 2 football fields a minute, a bit over 1 million acres a year. The Central Valley of California, which grows 1/4 of the nation's produce, is losing 15,000 acres a year to development. So, is this something that we can just keep on doing forever? No, obviously not. And during this time period from the 70s to now, we've gained a couple of million acres of yards. So this is the kind of revolution I think needs to happen, is we need to completely rethink how we produce our food and how people interact to produce their food. There is one place, I think it's in Canada, a city in Canada, where this couple started a farm, and their farm was basically, they went out to the neighborhood, to a suburban neighborhood, and they talked to all the people, and they said, can we farm your yard? And some people had the time to help them, some people don't. And then they did a CSA, which is basically all these the produce from all these people's yards. And you could grow one thing in one yard and one thing in another yard, so not every yard had to have all the different kinds of vegetables. And so this was their farm. So imagine if somebody said, well, oh, you're a farmer? You go, yeah, I'm a farmer. Where do you farm? Hawaii Kai. we're in Hawaii Kai. No, Hawaii Kai is my farm. So it's those kinds of things that we need to start changing, that we need to start doing a lot differently. We need to get people a lot more involved, because the climate change stuff is happening. California agriculture is in big trouble because of climate change. That place that I talked in Malawi, their problems because of climate change, it's happening all over the place. But we need to start acting now. We need to create a new system, and the system's got to be recreating communities, basically. And that other thing about recreating communities, kids go through school, and there are a lot of school garden programs in schools, but it's not part of the core curriculum. What if we made learning how to grow food and all of the things associated with it part of the core curriculum? And there are programs out there where you can teach everything that we want kids to learn about anything. You can teach it through growing food. All kinds of different, any math stuff you want to learn, you can learn it that way. Science stuff, you can learn it that way. Even art. We have kids that come up to our farm, and sometimes part of their exercise is they go find a nice quiet spot and they sit there and they write a reflection, or they write a poem, or they draw a picture, so all of those kinds of things can all be turning our focus back to the environment that we're actually living in, the things that are around us. So those are some of the ideas, I think, for changing the way that we do things. Luciano talked about the density of different kinds of projects. This is another interesting fact. From 1982 to 1997, the U.S. population grew by 17%, but the amount of urbanized land grew by 47%. So we've basically been building bigger and bigger houses and taking up more and more area. So all of those kinds of things need to be looked at and taken into account when our regional planners are looking at things. And as Luciano also said, basically the policy in the state of Hawaii and in the United States in general is our economy is based on population growth. We need to have more people. The whole construction industry, they use the state, they look at population projections, they look at birth rates, death rates, they look at that kind of stuff, but they also look at what our main economic drivers, construction and tourism, what they need in order to be healthy. And so they use those projections of the health of those industries, which is constantly building, constantly having more tourists, as one of the ways to figure out what our population is going to be. So it would be nice if the media started reporting things a lot differently. If they didn't report that, new housing starts were up, that's good news. It's always good news. I've never heard it said anything other than that. NPR, which, they're supposed to be enlightened, and, there's public radio and all that kind of stuff, they still all report that economic news exactly the same way. More is always better. And so I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to cover, I think. Oahu does have a lot of land. Hawaii has a lot of land. A lot of farming can go on, but for sure we've got to look at our water resources. And if we're doing a different kind of agriculture, not that industrial kind of agriculture, which basically depletes our soil and is the kind of agriculture that we have is a huge contribution to climate change, a huge contribution. And that nitrogen fertilizer goes into the ground. Most of it doesn't even stay there. Most of it volatilizes and goes into the air as nitrous oxide, which is a way stronger climate change problem than CO2. So agriculture, the kind of agriculture we have is a major contribution to the climate change problems that we have. And so we've got to change that style of agriculture. And that's the kinds of things that I'm talking about is more cover crop kind of agriculture, less of all the different inputs of all the different kinds of chemicals and things like that. GMO is just, it's another form of industrialized agriculture. So we need to basically, I think, shift the American dream from getting off the farm, which is what it was all these years, to getting back onto a farm. So that's...
Okay, thank you.